Okay, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Tonight is our second class about the Latin High Middle Ages. Remember that for the first part of our course, we went over the first 1,000 years and what the Orthodox view is of theology, of prayer, of art, of government, and so forth. And now we've started the part where we're talking about what happened when the West changed, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries. Of course, there were changes and there were disputes between East and West before then. But the 12th and 13th centuries are the time when there's this definitive break. So during our last class, we began our exploration of this key period of the Latin High Middle Ages, roughly the 12th and 13th centuries, the 1100s and 1200s. The all-important epoch of profound changes in the Western Church, not just little disputes over specific dogmatic questions, but entire changes in the way of seeing everything that marked a definitive break with Orthodox spiritual life, theology, and culture. So following Father Seraphim Rose's outline in Lecture 2 of his Orthodox Survival course, we propose to cover 5 or perhaps 6 topics: scholasticism, romance, the new concept of sanctity, the Chiliast teachings of Joachim of Flora, art, and politics. Though during that class I mentioned that we would leave aside Joachim of Flora, I've changed my mind, because today I was studying him, and I see now why Father Seraphim included him. Because his Chiliast utopian reinterpretation of Scripture became very influential in all subsequent Western Christian thought, and even some Orthodox thought, about the relationship of the Church to the world and a Christian philosophy of history. His ideas are very relevant to our own time. This Joachim of Flora, we'll see, he's an interesting character. And when we get to politics, especially in the relationship of the Church to the state, and the relationship of the Church to society, these utopian ideas actually are very important. Also, I've realized we really need to take our time and take longer to cover this period. It's the most important period for our purposes, because this is where the errors, the wrong turns of this period set the direction for everything that comes later. Right? It sets the stage. It heads the West in the direction which is going to go for 1,000 years leading up to our own time. So tonight we're just going to concentrate on sacred art, and next week we'll talk about Joachim's utopianism and also the subject of the church and politics, the church and state. And these two subjects actually dovetail very well with each other. But before we look at the sacred art, and very importantly the architecture of the West, which Father Seraphim didn't mention in his lectures about the architecture. He just talked about painting. We're going to talk a little about architecture. I want to cover 2 topics relating to this. I want to talk about the thought of a Russian writer called Petirim Sorokin. And also I need to go back and review what we said earlier about the genuine Orthodox concept of sacred art in our earlier class. So as I've said earlier in our course, now and then I'd like to introduce you to secular scholars whose work can help us acquire the intellectual tools to understand this subject matter we're studying. Okay. One important writer in this regard is a Russian named Petirim Sorokin, who lived from 1889 to 1968. He used the methods of sociology. He was actually a sociologist. He was the head of sociology at Harvard University for many decades. And he used the tools of sociological analysis to identify 3 cultural types or periods. He was not just a typical modern specialist who thought of himself only as a sociologist. He was really a philosopher of history. He was a student of culture and of theology. But he used the tools of sociological analysis to identify the cultures of succeeding periods of history and develop a whole theory about a whole model for understanding different cultures. So he identified 3 main cultural types, what he called the ideational, the idealistic, and the sensate. And we're going to see how that applies to our study of art tonight, and actually to all these questions that we're talking about. This model is very helpful for us to understand the transition from the first to the second millennium that took place in the Christian West. Now, though baptized and buried as an Orthodox Christian, we don't think of Sorokin as an Orthodox thinker. Now, my brother priest, Father James Thornton, who's a part of our church, he wrote a little monograph called Petirim Sorokin, Prophet of Spiritual Renewal, and he emphasizes the Orthodox aspects of Sorokin's thought. And Sorokin, as an Orthodox person, But actually, if you really study Sorokin, if you really read his writings, and if you look at his life story, right, he's not a strict or conservative Orthodox, but he is a great thinker who had genuine insights. And this model he created can help us understand different portions of history. Okay, so who was Sorokin? He was actually a liberal Democrat. He was actually active in the Kerensky government, the provisional government, after the abdication of the Tsar. But then Lenin arrested him. But at one point, when they were being nice and letting go of some of the intellectuals, they let him go. And he went to the West, and eventually he became the head of sociology in Harvard. He was considered, he's really the greatest sociologist of the 20th century. But he's not widely read anymore because his ideas are very unpopular, because he was a very ferocious critic of modern culture. He just said it like it was, about all the degeneration of 20th century Western culture. And he wrote a book, one of the best books, if you want to be introduced to his thought, probably the best book is a book called Crisis of Our Age, written in the 1930s. It's a short book. The Crisis of Our Age.
Didn't he write Fathers and Sons?
No, that's Turgenev.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Turgenev is a novelist.
Right.
Yeah. No, Sorokin is a sociologist, a 20th century figure. Turgenev is a 19th century novelist. Okay. So he was not really in his theological thinking. Sorokin is not an Orthodox, right? He's a universalist. For him, Orthodoxy was one stream of the great tradition, along with Catholicism and Buddhism and so forth. And his historical thought is cyclical; it's not linear. Remember, true Christian historical thought is linear. There's a beginning, the middle, and the end, right? But for Sorokin, all history goes in cycles, and these three stages of culture just keep repeating each other. So he has faith in his writings. Says, I have faith that this degenerate Western culture is going to be reborn into a new stage of ideational culture. But that's based on that faith is based on his theories about the inevitable cycles of culture, not on some kind of actual spiritual, not repentance in the Orthodox sense.
Like a pendulum swing?
Or more like pendulum swing or going around and around. Like our cultures, so here's Sorokin's theory, that a culture in its youth, in its childhood and youth, all cultures are ideational. That is, all genuine human culture starts with a very strong spiritual ideal. And all the cultural manifestations are directed towards leading people to that eternal spiritual ideal. That this life, as to use some of the terminology we used earlier in talking about Orthodox culture, that all the cultural manifestations are transparent, that they mediate an eternal reality. And so in this life, you live in an ascetic, simple way, and all of your art and architecture, prayer, liturgy, economy, crafts, everything you do is oriented to this invisible, eternal ideal, and they mediate that ideal. Right? It's all based on that ideal, and it mediates the ideal. You're not trying to bring the ideal from heaven to earth and make it three-dimensional or concrete. But you're creating cultural manifestations that help you stay in touch with that ideal, that mediate it, where it comes to you. It reaches you through that transparent veil, or that translucent veil, you see. And he identifies this as the longest and the most the strongest period of any culture. Then the other major type of culture is a sensate culture. In a sensate culture, the focus is on the senses, material things, this world, the achievements in this world, building things for this world, making this life as comfortable as possible, as successful as possible, in a purely material sense. And then, but between the two, as a little bridge or transitional period, there's a period he calls idealistic culture, where the spiritual ideals are still present, but that there's more attention paid to the material, and there's a greater use of purely material or earthly means to glorify or to talk about or to put into practice the eternal ideals. So now Sorokin himself really admired the period we're talking about. He admired the Western culture of the 13th century, which is he identified as an idealistic period. He liked, he preferred, or his might say his favorite, if he had a favorite type, part of these favorite stage in this development is the idealistic stage, where there's still the spiritual focus and the eternal values, but that this worldly means are used to express them, to praise them, to talk about them, to incarnate them in the society, which is actually what we see in the 13th century, 12th and 13th century Western Christian culture. Because from the Orthodox point of view, the so-called idealistic is simply a degeneration. It's letting go of the strict spiritual focus and drifting off into an uncertain cycle of innovation. Because from the Orthodox point of view, there aren't these inevitable cycles, right? Christ came to the world, he established his church, and created in its forms, a perfected cultural synthesis, which is Byzantine Orthodoxy. There's no reason for it to end, right? Because you can always develop, within this ideational framework, you can always develop effective scientific and practical measures to take care of the needs of life. Okay? There's a mistake. People make the mistake to think that, well, if you're too spiritual, you can't be practical, right? But that's not true, right? It's only that people use the necessity for creating practical riches for dealing with practical life that they excuse themselves from dealing with the spiritual. But actually, in the case of the West, in the High Middle Ages, what they really did was that they became spiritually deluded. See, Sorokin doesn't have that perspective, right? He's speaking as a liberal and as a detached historian of culture. But from our Orthodox point of view, which is higher and understands things more deeply, we see that what happened with the West was not simply an evolution of their culture, but they became spiritually deluded. They denied certain dogmas of the faith, and they became spiritually deluded both in their method of theology, as we discussed in our last class. The method of theology went from being traditional to being dialectic. The spiritual life went from being traditional and being sober to being non-traditional and being emotional and imaginative, as we see exemplified in the character of Francis of Assisi. Okay. So, I don't have the Crisis of Our Age, but I thought I'd bring you and show you. This is a one-volume condensation of his magnum opus, which is Social and Cultural Dynamics. It's originally in 4 volumes. It's way too dense. It has all these tables and charts showing all of his analyses, going back to the pharaohs. I mean, going back to all of history, the Egyptians, the Greeks, everybody. Yeah, highly, very analytical examination tables. He examined, and this is before the internet, right? This is even before microfilm. He went to libraries and examined thousands and thousands of books and thousands of examples of art from all of known human history, and tabulated the types of art that existed in different centuries and different epochs of every culture he could possibly study. And out of this, he formulated this theory. Now, the man was a genius. Okay? What's important for us is that this model of the ideational, idealistic, and sensate is very useful, and it really identifies a great deal of what we see in our own Christian history, where for the first 1,000 years, everyone, both East and West, was living in an ideational culture. Right? As we said earlier, much earlier, about theology and art in the Orthodox period of the West, as well as Orthodoxy throughout its history up till now. Okay? What's important is the eternal world, is our eternal salvation, and what's real, the eternal world is much more real than this world. And all of our theology, all the church's theology, our method of prayer, the iconography, the liturgy, even the way the Orthodox societies are constructed, is all intended to be transparent. That it's just mediating the eternal reality which is coming to meet us from the next world. Okay? We're not trying to create heaven on earth. We're not trying to take those eternal things and make them into something earthly that we can hang on to or control. They are always beyond in the heavenly realm, but they're being mediated to us quite directly, right? Through very transparent, very spiritual, and yet material realities, right? So this is the sacramental life. What we call it the mysteriological or sacramental life is a life in which material things are taken and transformed through grace and prayer according to tradition and made into means of mediating the eternal realities, right? But in what happens in the 12th and 13th centuries in the West is that they go from this ideational to what Sorokin would call an idealistic culture. Now we're going to describe what that means specifically, but let's go back now, and now that we've talked a little bit about Sorokin and this model, let's go back and talk about Orthodox sacred art and review what we said back in class 5. This is I think the third page of the notes. Let's review what we said in class 5 about Orthodox or genuine Christian sacred art. Okay. Recall that in our first class in the early church, we described the church's character as eschatological, that is focused on the end of all things, the consummation of all things, right? Otherworldly, focused on the next life, on the heavenly world, martyric, and ascetical. The insights we discussed in our later 2 classes regarding the church's true spiritual school and true theological method led us in the same direction, which is to conclude that a genuine sacred art must lead the believer into purification of the senses, cleansing from the passions, and pure prayer in this life. Okay? If it's genuine Orthodox sacred art, it'll lead you to purification of your senses, cleansing from the passions, and pure prayer. Notice, not mortification of the senses, right? Not the destruction of the senses, as we see in Islamic or iconoclastic thought, but purification of the senses, refinement of the senses, right? Cleansing from the passions. Not the destruction of our natural attributes or energies, but the cleansing. And pure prayer in this life. And thus to the heavenly kingdom in the next life. And this kingdom we experience already in this life through mysteriological and prayerful communion with God. So the purpose of Orthodox art, as all Orthodox culture, is anagogical. Anagogy means to lead up. Ana is up. Gogi is from the ago, to lead. Right? So all of Orthodox art is anagogical. It's not to celebrate the world, as we see in pop modern theology, right? Worldly so-called theology, but to lead the soul upwards to union with God. Right? So this anagogical function necessitates that true sacred art must be hierarchical and hieratic. Hierarchical means having a hierarchy, right? Having top to bottom order, right? And hieratic means priestly, sacred. The forms and images here below are part of a great hierarchy of forms, which extend downward from the heavenly archetypes to their earthly representations, as explained by St. Dionysius. And we read earlier in the course, we read from St. Dionysius the Areopagite about the heavenly hierarchies, right? Where he describes all of reality really as being hierarchical, a great cosmic hierarchy with God above the top of the hierarchy, and then the angels, the saints, and so on down to the visible realm, and the church and the church's ministers who mediate God's grace through the mysteries. Okay. Well, the art does the same thing. So a priest, a bishop or a priest celebrating the liturgy is a priest, but in a sense, an artist, right? The iconographer, the poet, the craftsman is performing a priestly function, that he's taking the material things of this world and through grace and through his own human gifts, the God's grace and the God's gifts of nature that he gave him and his training, he transforms it and it becomes a means of mediating the heavenly realities. Okay. So the art is hieratic, it's priestly, and that it has a specific priestly function. It offers to the believer the sacred mystery, and it transforms the believer so he can offer himself back as a sacrifice to the Father, right? Who reigns at the top of this cosmic, supercosmic hierarchy, the Father who sacrificed the Lamb of God before the ages for us. So the techniques of this art in all of its media, whenever the Orthodox sacred artist is choosing his techniques and his media, okay, he has in mind a certain transparency. The art doesn't draw attention to itself, and the art does not draw attention to the artist. It leads us beyond itself to the eternal world, to God, to the Mother of God, to the angels, to the saints, to the spiritual life. Okay. It's an art that's transparent and it's anonymous, because the artist is not working as the artist is working as a member of a community. So iconography should not be signed. Right? He's performing his work as an act of worship to God, not for his personal glorification. Right. Now let's go to the high medieval sacred art and its architecture. Right. So now when the Latins go through this period of change in the 12th and 13th century, they don't change all of this at once. Right? We're not talking about jumping from Orthodox art to 19th century plaster statues or Sacred Heart of Jesus pictures or things like that. We're talking about just moving over just a bit, and they keep some of this. For example, they keep in the 12th and 13th centuries, they keep the anonymous aspect. You don't know who painted most of those paintings. You don't know who made most of those sculptures. You don't know who built those cathedrals. They have a few names. It's mostly anonymous. They kept that idea in mind, right? And they were still very focused on eternal or heavenly realities, but they made a subtle change. So what would happen? What will happen when an intensely religious people get tired, or they get deluded, they get led astray, and they get tired of the really real being beyond the veil of the senses, being there, not here. They're kind of losing their grip on that it's there, it's not here. Okay? But they don't want to plunge from the ideational world of their fathers straight into some sensate world, some carnal world, right? They're going to take their beloved ideal and make it present here on earth in a way that's very intense, it's very attractive. But they overstep the canonical bounds laid down by their fathers. Right? They take their ideal and they enclose it in a beautiful box, so it's right there with them, instead of being in the eternal world. They're bringing it to them, and they are also simultaneously making their own thrust upward. Whereas the Orthodox life, it's the opposite. Right? We don't make our own thrust upward. We wait in humility and God comes to us, but we don't grab him and bring him to us. He just comes to us. And all the art and architecture is just to mediate this, to allow this to happen. Okay. So they're still inspired by their eternal ideals, and the art still inspires them with these eternal ideals. They're not plunging just into carnal or sensual things like we see later in the Renaissance. Okay. Now this is what the scholastics did with their theology. Okay. If you read scholastic theology, it's not just a whole bunch of heresies. It's not something ridiculous or just evil, a bunch of heresies. But what they did is they made the shift, they flipped. Whereas for the Holy Fathers, the apophatic approach, that is starting on what we don't know about God, is where we start. And we realize that there are more things that we don't know about God than we do know about him, than we can say about him. The scholastics flipped that around. They said, no, it's more important what we do say about God. And they're always, and from then on, they're always adding to what they want to say about God. They're always adding new things to what they want to say about God. Okay? So they took the theology, which up to that point was very respectful of the mystery of God. They didn't try to answer all the questions. And they put the theology in this box of Aristotle's philosophy. They brought it down to earth, so to speak. And that's what the high medieval religious orders did with holiness. When Francis transformed the image of the saint from being an icon of Christ to being another Christ. It's a very important difference. Up to the time of Francis, the saint is an icon of Christ. But what do they call Francis? His followers call him another Christ. And also the Catholics started applying this to the priesthood. In the Orthodox thought, the bishop or the priest is an icon of Christ. But in the Catholic theology, the priest is an alter Christus, another Christ. Like instead of the priest being an icon, they took the icon out of the screen, they made it a three-dimensional doll, wound it up, and it's walking around, it's another Christ. For them, that's what a priest is. Or that's what a saint is. Okay. But that matches this new art, which is more worldly. It's still religious. It's even very respectful. It's even very reverent, but it's become worldly. That's why they start developing the three-dimensional art of the statues. Okay. They want to enclose their beloved ideal in something they get their hands on in this world. Right? Now, this is analogous to an experience we've all had. And we've all had the experience of reading a book. We love the book. It's a great book. And the book appeals to our imagination. And when we read the book, it opens up our mind, and we can imagine how the characters were, how they talked, and so forth and so on.
Then see the movie.
Okay, exactly. And we discuss the book with others, and they have a very rich experience of the same book, but I don't impose my vision of the book on you. We all have the book is so beautiful because it opens up this whole beautiful universe of shared visions of what it could be, what it could mean. It's very rich, right? But it's intangible. You can't get your hands on it, right? And you say, "Oh, I wish I'd see that in the movie," right? Then we see it in the movie, and the movie can be brilliant, and the movie can be very beautifully done. But we always say, "Still not as good as the book." Why? Because they try to enclose. Well, even an ordinary book, but written beautifully, or a book of classic literature. It's not holy, right? It's not spiritual reading, but it's still something that has an invisible aspect that can't be enclosed in one plastic or material vision, right? Because our intellect, our heart is bigger than that. Right?
You can't capture the essence.
You can't capture it, okay? So what they did with their medieval art, with their statues, their Gothic cathedrals, is that they put all their heart and soul into building this incredible version of this spiritual ideal that we've been worshiping for these persons, the Holy Trinity, Christ. We've been worshiping for 1,000 years, but now they've solidified it, right? They captured it. It's no longer iconographic. It's become a thing in itself. Okay. So Saint Seraphim in his lecture of Father Seraphim, not Saint Seraphim, that's another subject. Father Seraphim Rose in his lecture, this lecture 2, he spends time on paintings. He talks about Duccio of Siena, who died in 1319, and Giotto of Florence, who died in 1337. They're the two best-known high medieval Italian painters. Already we see now, in our earlier class in sacred art, we stopped a lot and looked at things on the internet, but I don't want to do that tonight because that really created huge pauses for the people who are going to listen to the podcast. So after class tonight, what we can do, if we want to stay afterwards and look at some of these pictures, we can, after we finish the class, we'll go look on the internet, or you can just go home and look these up. Already we see and Duccio and Giotto are not the only ones, but they are the preeminent representatives. The change in painting took place mainly in Italy. That's where the most important development took place, whereas the change in architecture took place mainly in France, in Northern Europe, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So with Duccio and Giotto, that although they're staying somewhat within the old canonical boundaries, a shift from the transparent, strictly spiritual, timeless character of real iconography to a more opaque, this-worldly, temporal approach, especially with Giotto. We see this with Giotto. The change in Duccio is more subtle. Okay? You would have to study it pretty closely, and really you have to pray in front of it to really see the difference. When you go home and you look up Duccio, you'll see what I'm talking about. His art is just beautiful. It's exquisite. And it's almost iconography. But he stepped a little bit away from it. You'll see. Okay, you'll see what I'm talking about. With Giotto, however, it's obvious. He's using a lot of the old forms, even some of the old technique, but he has shifted clearly to a dynamic and emotional style, a worldly style, bringing the spiritual reality into more of an earthly box. He's the first one to show the crucifixion taking place in the town square in Florence, for example, something like that. So he's making it contemporary, he's making it worldly. And he's showing faces with emotion, sometimes vicious emotion. You see. So it's that first step towards what we later come to call Renaissance art. Now you can easily explore samples of these paintings nowadays on the internet. Now we've got the internet, we can see very good photographs of all these paintings. Of course, the best way is to see them in person. I remember spending hours when I was a young man in front of some wonderful duchos in the West Wing of the National Gallery in Washington. If you go to Washington, go to the West Wing of the National Gallery. Don't go to the East Wing; it's just a bunch of modern junk. Go to the West Wing to see centuries of traditional Western art. And there's one room with medieval art. It has one Byzantine icon, a famous large icon of the Mother of God enthroned that was painted in Constantinople. But the rest of the art is mostly medieval Italian art, and there are a couple of famous duchios there. One of them is the Call of the Apostles, as I remember. There's another duccio that's now even more famous. It's a Madonna, little bitty Madonna that was discovered only about 20 years ago. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the director of the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, went to bid on it, and he asked to spend. Metropolitan Museum of Art is in New York.
Yeah, where was it?
I don't remember. I don't know if the auction was in London or where it took place, but he knew he's going to be bidding against the American National Gallery, against the Louvre, the British Museum. He's bidding against all the big boys. So he went there, and I forget his name. He was a famous director that met in New York. And he asked to spend 45 minutes with this Madonna. It's like this big. He spent 45 minutes with it. He went back and offered them $45 million for it. And he bought it. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So it's exquisite, all right. But it's not quite iconography. But you'd really have, it's more subtle though. The change is subtle. But with Giotto, the change is very obvious.
Wasn't Giotto influenced by the plague, by the disasters that happened at that time during the
Let's see, he died in
medieval?
1337.
It doesn't seem to, because I think the plague was in 1340 something.
Yeah, but it started toward the east and went west. So I'm not sure. I mean, a great deal of 14th century thought and the social situation is influenced greatly by the plague, but I don't remember the exact chronology of the plague. Certainly, there's a lot of sculpture. Another area you could investigate, and I did a project on this when I was a college student, is looking at the tympana of medieval cathedrals. The tympanum is a semicircular sculpture over the west entrance to the church. Usually it's the Last Judgment, or it's Pentecost. Okay. And when I was in college, my main professor, he said, "You do a project on this." He knew I was interested in the change that took place in the West at that period. And he said, "Do a project where you examine tympana from late Romanesque cathedrals built in the 11th century through high Gothic built, say, in the 15th century." Well, I did this. This is again before the internet. I was getting out big books out of the library and looking at black and white photographs of these great cathedrals. And it's a very clear shift where the early medieval tympana have bas-reliefs. Bas-relief, is very just raised sculpture, just almost like two-dimensional sculpture almost, if you could say such a thing, right? And the art is very theological. It's very iconographic. It's very theological. But by the end of the period, and especially after the plague period, the depiction of the Last Judgment is certainly incredibly well executed, but it's psychologically traumatic. Just the very, very carnal, very passionate depiction of suffering and so forth. It's not calm anymore. It's not dispassionate. It's not iconographic. It's worldly. It's a great religious theme, and it's about a dogma that the people believed in. But the art itself has become passionate. Right? It's become worldly. It's attracting attention to itself. Right? And it's locking the mind in a worldly or passionate or carnal conception of this great mystery. But it's gone from iconography to being to religious art that is no longer iconographic. Okay. So I had this wonderful experience of looking at these duchios in Washington, but I realized, even when I was just a kid, I was like 21, 22 years old, and I was looking at them, praying and so forth, and saying, it's not quite right. It's so beautiful. It's so moving, but it's not quite right. At that time, I couldn't articulate exactly what had happened, but I knew something had happened. Okay? They convinced me something had happened. A corner had been turned. The religion they represented was very beautiful. It was still very beautiful, but it was very dynamic. It was something admirable, but it was already of this world. Okay? Not entirely, but definitely, okay, of this world. Okay? Now, in somewhat earlier, slightly earlier development, but equally important, perhaps even more important, because architecture is the queen of the arts, right? Because architecture includes everything, right? Architecture incorporates everything, all the visual arts, right? It took place in Northern Europe, at first in France, with the creation of what came to be called the Gothic architecture. Okay. So the first clear example of this school is the famous reconstruction of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis on the outskirts of Paris under the abbot Suger, who died in 1151. We were just last year and a few months ago, we were at Saint Denis in Paris. And if you're interested in French history, it's very important because it's the mortuary church of the kings of France. And they have images, and in some cases, the bones of all the kings of France going back to Clovis, who was baptized by St. Remigius in 495. But it was an old abbey. It was an old monastery, but it was rebuilt. The Abbey Church was radically reconstructed in the 12th century to be the first example of what's called Gothic architecture. The most complete, the most sublime examples are the exquisite little Sainte-Chapelle in the center of Paris, built during the time of Louis IX, whom the Catholics call St. Louis, who died in 1270, and the most famous Chartres Cathedral. So if you want to look up, if you were you want to do a quick study of Gothic, and you didn't have much time, just look up those three. You'll get a very good idea. These are some of the most famous examples of the Gothic architecture. So here are these famous buildings. Okay, I think you all know what I'm talking about. You can imagine these. You've seen pictures of these buildings or buildings like them, right? They take your breath away when you visit them. I've been to two of these. I've been to Saint Denis and to the Sainte-Chapelle. They're amazing, right? They'll blow you away. They're magnificent. Okay. But what's wrong with them? There's something wrong with them from the Orthodox point of view. Okay. The modernist Roman Catholic theologian Romano Guardini, he accurately and evocatively describes what's wrong with them. He says the spire is that pointy tower they put on the top of them, right? Okay. He describes the spire of the Gothic cathedral as man's finger reaching to heaven to pierce the heart of God. It's a very strong image. He used it at the beginning of a book called The End of the Modern World by Romano Guardini. They're striving so hard to reach up to God and bring him down to earth. They're very serious. They're trying really, really hard. But they're going up there to pierce the heart of God. We're going to reach up with that spire. It's almost like a prototype of like a space rocket or something. Right? They're just reaching up to heaven with those vast, extremely tall steeples, right? In other words, these people really loved God in their own way. They meant to love God, right? They were trying to love God. They're not like the later worldly Renaissance artists who are just using religious themes in their art to glorify their egos or wallow in some fleshly subject matter. Not like some Renaissance artist who used his mistress as a model for the Virgin Mary or something like that. This is earlier than that. These are not these kinds of people. Right? They're so seriously religious people. Okay. But with their incredible zeal and their talent, they overstepped their bounds. Right? They became passionate. They went beyond the patristic canons or traditions. They created something so close to, they created something that was such a good imitation of the heavenly. It's like, it's the movie, right? It's not the book. But being itself something worldly, they put it in a box, a beautiful box, an amazing box, still a box, right? Like the scholastic theology that locks God into this box of Aristotelian philosophy, right, metaphysics. Gothic architecture locks God into a wonderful but finite architectural form. No matter how big they get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's still finite. Whereas an Orthodox church can be a tiny chapel. When you walk in, it's bigger on the inside than the outside. Right? It's infinite. Our little chapel here. This little bitty chapel with these mounted prints in an office space with fluorescent lights, it's still more sacred than the greatest Gothic cathedral. Right? You communicate with the eternal. Um, I remember again that same time when I was living in Washington, I went to the National Cathedral, which is this amazingly well done, huge Gothic cathedral in Washington, D.C. It's like they took a famous church from Europe and just put it in Washington, D.C., called the National Cathedral. It's an Episcopalian church, Anglican. And I walked around it for hours and hours and hours, looking at every nook and cranny of it, just thinking. This is so beautiful, but it's dead. Okay? It's so beautiful. It's heartbreaking. It's just so beautiful, but it's dead. It's opaque. It doesn't lead beyond itself. It talks about God, but it's not a transparent window to God. Okay? I know I'm talking in very poetic, or I'm talking in images, but I don't know how else to talk about art. You just have to, I think you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? So here in North America, we have the National Cathedral. Here in Detroit, you can go look at the some local Episcopalian churches that are very, very well done. There's Christ Church in Grosse Pointe, where, by the way, Anna Hatcher's mother goes to church. Christ Church in Bloomfield Hills across from the Cranbrook complex. And you can see they're not. It's not in Europe. It's not Chartres or Peterborough Cathedral, but they're good examples of the Gothic. All right. So what is the Gothic? Okay. What is the Gothic? The Gothic architecture. The idea of Gothic architecture is to create vast frames to hang stained glass. Okay? They're vast stone frames to hang hundreds of square yards of stained glass to depict scenes from Scripture. If you go to the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, they have a little window for every story from the Old Testament. Every single chapter of the Old Testament. It's thousands of images, all exquisitely done. Okay? So the idea of a Gothic cathedral is that you create these vast stone frames, you hang stained glass, and then on sunny days the sun shines through, and it's like walking into a giant jewel box. You can't, it's sensually, it's overwhelming. Right? It is an amazing feat, right? So how do they make these buildings stand up? They invented. There are two engineering inventions. One is the pointed arch, which makes it possible to go higher with a wall, to support. And the other is the flying buttress, where you create supports on the outside to hold up. They're not temporary, as like a scaffolding or something when you're building it. They're permanent. They're permanent. They're called the flying buttress because of their dramatic leap, where it's a stone support that comes up and leaps up and holds up the wall. Okay. So with the pointed arch and the flying buttress, they could create these vast frameworks. Now what's going on here? The Roman Catholic historian Christopher Dawson, whom I've mentioned before, okay, offers another insight about this. In one of his essays, I don't remember which, I'm sorry, he says that with the innovative Gothic engineering miracle, holding these vast yet delicate frameworks, because the whole thing could fall apart very easily, right? It's very precise. What they had to do was very precise. Okay. Holding together these vast yet delicate frameworks of stone with the pointed arch and the flying buttress, the church building goes from being simply a building, properly speaking, something at rest, something solid, comforting, static, firmly grounded on the earth, something fundamentally humble in its essence, no matter how grand its outer form, a building. It goes from being a building to being a machine. This building's actually, it doesn't look like it's moving, but it's always in dynamic tension. It's a machine. Something in continuous dynamic tension, something in activity, constantly striving, never at rest. Okay. This is an admirably apt observation. Okay. It shows how we've gone from the method of tradition to the method of dialectic. Right? A transition whose importance it is impossible to overemphasize. So, the contrast. Here's Hagia Sophia, a vast building, but it's really just a building. It's a big hunk of brick sitting on the earth. By the way, Hagia Sophia is built of brick, by the way. It had marble revetment covering, but it's built of brick. Okay, it's just sitting on the earth, and when you walk into Hagia Sophia, there's the dome, right? But the dome isn't a point reaching up to heaven to grab the heavens. The dome mediates God coming to us. And no matter how big an Orthodox church gets, if it's really good, we've said this before, is if it's really good Orthodox architecture, no matter how big an Orthodox church gets, it still has a domestic feeling. You're at home. Even if there's one person worshiping, you don't feel that the church is empty. Especially if there are no pews. One thing I hate about pews is that if the pews aren't full, you feel like the church is empty. But I know we've all had the experience of a church in the old country. We walk in, there are no pews. There are lots of unalloy with icons, candles burning. It could be an afternoon vespers, with just a chanter and the priest, and you're standing there. It doesn't feel empty at all, right? It's full. It's full, and it's domestic. You feel at home. It's not crushing you, right? But if you walk into Chartres, or you walk into one of the great English cathedrals, which are even larger, gigantic Peterborough Cathedral, I don't know how many football fields it is. You're overwhelmed, you're crushed, you're an ant. You're going, wow, this is amazing. But you don't feel at home, right? Because it's drawing attention to itself. It's just so magnificent, it's so great. Whereas when you can walk into the greatest examples of Orthodox architecture, and you can marvel at, it's a large building, and so forth. But it doesn't crush you, it doesn't overwhelm you. Now, there are bad examples of Orthodox architecture that aren't really Orthodox. For example, the Italianate churches in St. Petersburg, built by the westernizing czars, like St. Isaac's or the Kazanskaya Sobor in Petersburg. They're just Italian, big Baroque Italian churches with Italianized iconography stuck in them. Right? That's not really. They are Orthodox churches. I'm not denying they're Orthodox, but it's not Orthodox architecture. Okay, that's Western architecture. You can in Romania, you can see the contrast between, if you go to Iași, and you see the contrast between the Three Hierarchs Church and the new Cathedral of St. Paraschiva. When I say new, I mean 19th century, where St. Paraschiva's relics are. The difference is right there. The Three Hierarchs, that's really an Orthodox church. It's just magnificent. It's so beautiful. You walk in and it's just glowing on the inside with golden mosaics. And you wonder, why did they move her to that big... Well, they moved her because they built a bigger church. Okay? But you walk in and it's all right. It's a church, right? But still, it's Italianate, all right?
But they still use the old one.
They still use the old one. It's still praying in Three Hierarchs.
They don't sell it to anybody.
No. They don't sell to anybody. Of course not. Three Hierarchs in Iași was covered on the outside with gold. The Turks built fires around it and melted down all the gold and stole all the gold. But it still has beautiful stone carvings on the outside. So you can imagine what it looked like. Stone carvings covered with gold. It must have been something. So to get back to our subject, getting back to Dawson's remark, he didn't mean this as a criticism, even as a compliment. He was just describing a new development, right, that he was admirable. But as Orthodox, we see that we've got a problem here with this building becoming a machine, right? Again, as with dialectical theology that we talked about last time with Thomas Aquinas and those people, we've left the sure ground of tradition, the solid ground, right, for an exciting but unpredictable flight of innovation. We're into the realm of continuous tension. Right? Now, another area of art that we don't have time for is literature. That's a huge thing all in itself, right? And the obvious paradigmatic monument of this period is Dante's Divine Comedy, which is written around 1300. Of course, the people think of this as some kind of old-fashioned Christian medieval work, but actually serious scholars recognize that it's really the beginning of modern literature. And this is a huge subject in itself. All I can do briefly is recommend that if you read a bit of Divine Comedy, you can get a flavor of it. And see how he's dealing with theological subjects, but it's in a very worldly way. He has a lot of genuine insights, but it's still not spiritual. It's no longer spiritual. Right? It's a worldly way of dealing with a spiritual subject. So Dante really believed. He wasn't some cynic who didn't believe. Dante really believed. And it's executed with an unbelievable skill. One of the greatest poems ever written, right? But it's definitely the medium is this worldly. But we could spend a whole semester talking about that, right? About the Divine Comedy. So to summarize then, to repeat, Orthodox art is transparent and it's sacramental. It's mysteriological. It mediates the next life, the next world, the spiritual world. Right? Icons are windows to heaven, as we've often been told, and it's true. Right? What we see in the West in the High Middle Ages is this subtle transition from iconographic art and architecture to what in Sorokin's construct would be called idealistic art. It's not carnal, it's not totally carnal, it's not totally worldly art, as we see later in the Renaissance. It still has high spiritual idealism to it. But it's impressing those ideals in a this-worldly way. It's like going from the book to the movie. It's going from the intellectual, the intelligible world to this world and try to incarnate those spiritual ideals, but it freezes them in that stone of those Gothic cathedrals. Or it freezes them in Giotto's artistic imagination, where he goes from a spiritual conception and a spiritual presentation to a passionate or all too human presentation of the subject, and yet still somewhat within the old canonical boundaries. They haven't flown off yet into the total worldliness of the Renaissance. Okay? That's what happens in that period, and it goes right along. It's totally consistent with what they did with their theology and what they did with their spiritual life. See? So Thomas Aquinas took the riches of the Orthodox tradition and he enclosed it in this tight system of his Aristotelian logic. Right? Francis of Assisi took sanctity, in which a saint is an icon of Christ, leading to Christ, and he enclosed it in himself. He's another Christ. It's something very admirable, but still stuck in this world. So it's really become another religion, or rather it's become something that's distinctly less than truly spiritual. And so the change is not as obvious as later deviations that they make, but it's very important because this is where the transition takes place. This is where the change takes place. That's why what's interesting, you read this transcript of this class by Father Seraphim. This was done back in the 70s, and he and Father Herman, his co-struggler, is interrupting sometimes, making comments, and they're both saying there's no way we can unite with this Roman Catholic Church. It's a totally different religion, even 1,000 years ago, because they were giving these talks also in the context of ecumenism and all that. They're saying there's no point in all this dialogue with the Roman Catholics. It's obviously something totally different. Okay? Even at that time, even so long ago, when they hadn't changed that much. Okay, it's very, very different. But to maintain this difference in our own minds, we have to be practicing Orthodox life. We have to be following the Fathers' tradition of how to pray, how to conduct the services, and so forth. And that's why it's very good, actually, a good thing in our time. We complain about the bad things in our time. A good thing in our time is there's a huge interest, a return of interest in real Byzantine iconography and chant and old ways of making the vestments. There's a lot of interest in the really more purely Orthodox and more purely Byzantine ways of doing things, which is a blessing. We need this. The way I think of it is that in His goodness and love, God has given us these tools to fight off all the other influences, and so it's a real blessing. Despite all the ecumenism and all the worldliness and all that, there's still this beautiful return of interest in the ancient forms, and we see what a blessing they are when we have the real traditional iconography, the real traditional chant. We see how it uplifts us, and it mediates these spiritual realities.